Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. I'm chatting tonight again with Alex Vezina, the CEO of Prepared Canada, an emergency preparedness company. Alex is the CEO and founder of this company, and it's sort of a new business initiative, business area, I would presume. Alex has an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree in emergency preparedness, and clearly something that we may not have had enough of before this pandemic. I've chatted with Alex a few times about his thoughts on the coronavirus, just as it was becoming an issue a month and a half ago, as recently as the last couple of weeks in regards to some of his attitudes towards some of the strategies that different governments are taking and some of the tactics different companies are taking. Alex, welcome back.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me, Brian.
So Alex, you wanted to tell me about the Krispy Kreme parking lot.
Well, I put it behind me so that you can see it. So for those of us who are watching this and not listening to it, you can see that. Yeah, in Mississauga, in Heartland, and in some other Krispy Kremes, there is quite the lineup. People really want their sugary delights. And what we talked last week about the malls and about corporate real estate, and we had a point of disagreement on what the malls would look like, whether or not people are going to go mostly to an online model. And to me, this is an example of why I think, especially the millennials and certain ages of people really want to get out and do stuff. They want to have social interaction. They want to buy something physically. And it's not about the ease of the purchase. It's about the experience, and people crave that experience. And I from what I've been hearing from people that I know that have actually been in this lineup, they went because they wanted to do something. They wanted an excuse to get out of their house, and they actually enjoyed waiting in that lineup for an hour plus. I know.
Alex,
I know.
No one enjoys waiting in a car lineup for an hour plus. Like,
you say that. You say that, but they told me they'd rather be there than in their home because it was something outside. I'm not even kidding.
That certainly is a negative toward their home life.
Fair enough, but that's the way.
And I think some people are going stir crazy, but this is not the future of our society, that we're all going to be lining up for an hour and a half for Krispy Kreme donuts. That's not what you're suggesting.
No, we'll just be open again. But the point is, malls aren't going to disappear because people want to go out and buy something. People want the experience of going out and buying things, and they're
want to get out.
Willing to do this.
They want to experience something, but they don't want to experience it in an hour and a half lineup. And the reality is, what you're seeing is socially distant. No one from one car was interacting with another car, were they?
As far as I know, no. But that's not the point here. The point is that they're not purchasing donuts through Uber Eats. They're saying, you know what, rather than getting my donuts through Uber Eats or through some sort of delivery service, I actually want to go out and wait in that lineup for over an hour, because it's better than sitting at home. And that's what they think. Whether or not it makes sense or whether or not you agree with it, they're doing it. And that's the important thing here. People are doing it. This is the trend that we're going to see from people. They want to go out and do something, which, has its own concerns on the response side.
Okay, so I agree with the idea of wanting to do something. Maybe what we need is some business people that are going to think up some more creative and beneficial ways to doing something in a healthy manner, rather than standing or sitting in a car in an hour and a half lineup in a Krispy Kreme donut parking lot.
Oh, I agree. Just the major point though here was, once again, that, in a year or 2 years, whenever this thing is over, we'll still have a mall. Like that's the major point, because there's going to be demand for it, because people want to go out and buy stuff.
Okay, well, this is what I'd like to talk about this tonight, because actually Governor Andrew Cuomo had a whole press conference, which was really effectively based on companies got to think through a new normal, how they reopen in a more healthy, more hygienic manner. And he was saying, I'm going to make some suggestions, and we're going to have some rules and regulations. But the reality is, it's up to businesses to make sure that their customers are healthy, and they have to think through exactly how they prepare, which sounds to me like it's your business about emergency preparedness and making sure that you've got a healthy, hygienic environment for people to enjoy. And I've got issues regards, I'm not sure whether people are going to want to walk around a mall in a crowded scenario, and or pick up clothing that other people have touched, and or pick up makeup that other people have touched. But maybe you're right that the malls will still be okay. But why don't we take a break for traffic and messages? I'll give you a chance to think about your response, and we'll come back and ask you about how companies, businesses should be thinking about preparing for reopening. Okay?
Okay.
Stay with us, everyone. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting again with the CEO of Prepared Canada, an emergency preparedness company, Alex Vezina, who is telling us about the Krispy Kreme donut lineup, but also about how he thinks people are desperate to get out and get back into doing things. And I agree. But I do think that we need to think about how we're going to be doing things. And so Alex says businesses reopen, and I gave you the example of Governor Andrew Cuomo from New York that was telling businesses that it's their problem and they got to think about how to reopen in a healthy and hygienic manner given our experience. And he's saying, let's not just think we're going to go back to yesterday. You can never go back to yesterday. He's saying, think about how you can make tomorrow a better tomorrow. If you were being hired by someone, some company to think about how to prepare for the new situation, what are the steps? What are the ideas? What are the thoughts that you're going to be taking people through?
Okay, so I think the question just changed significantly from what we said before the break. So I just want to kind of refine that. And also related to what you said post-break as opposed to pre-break, the major point from behind what I was saying before was not that people want to desperately get out, but that there's a large enough percentage of the population that feels that they need to purchase things in person as much as possible. And that demographic is large enough that we won't see malls as a figment of history, right? The point is, even if we lose a few now, they're going to come back because there's going to be demand for them. As for what business I would recommend businesses do right now, depends on the business. However, in my case, there is a large section of what I do with businesses where I focus on enhancing the customer experience while reducing the business's risk, usually resulting in a savings on parts of their insurance, depending on the business and what types of insurance they have. Usually the business saves money on the insurance side in excess of whatever the program costs. So what I mean by that, for example, is on the health and safety side, you may put something in place where the business spends X amount of dollars to make the business safer for employees and reduce the injury rate. And the injury rate gets impacted so much that their premiums on their insurance on the health and safety side and on some of their other risk sides actually get reduced so much the program essentially pays for itself and then makes the business money. So what I would do, depending on the business, depends on the business and depends on not just the industry, but the specific business in question, but that would be the overarching goal.
Okay. So I want to come back to the tactics of exactly what you would be suggesting to companies to think through, but you talk about insurance. So let me raise a question for you. One of the things that has been talked about in the United States is passing an exclusion such that people cannot sue companies for unhygienic places if they caught COVID-19 there. And this was meant as a protection to businesses, but I fear that what it is it's a protection to some companies and places that didn't really adhere to the social distancing rules as quickly as they should. So for an example, a mass church or a restaurant or a club that stayed open longer than they should have given the guidance on social distancing, if they stayed open longer than they could and they ended up having people that contracted the infection there, this law would actually allow them to get out of any liability. Is that the right thing? Shouldn't companies be liable for people that get COVID-19 in their establishment?
So to me, this is frankly a political question. This isn't as much of an ethical one, and the reasons for that. I'm going to play devil's advocate on that for a moment from the business perspective, because I think it's important to think about it this way. If you are allowed to sue a business because you caught COVID-19 at that business, but you caught it from someone who wasn't symptomatic at a time when your government wasn't taking things seriously, should you be liable? Like, think about that for a moment. With how easy it's spreading and how near impossible it is for the government to control, is it reasonable to expect that a business, especially small business, restaurant, et cetera, is able to control spread? I don't think that's reasonable.
But if you knew, and there was lots of information in the media that said that that this virus was out there, that people were infecting others, and you continue to operate, so for an example, I'm thinking about movie theaters, I'm thinking
Oh,
about
I know.
churches, I'm
Yep.
thinking about restaurants that stayed open after guidance came out to close down and to isolate.
Right, but most people didn't know uh, anything. Further, even right now, if you talk to virtually anyone that isn't really speaking, not speaking, but listening to the media and doesn't have some sort of insider information on what's happening with health, you talk to 5-10 different people, you're going to get 5-10 different understandings on what's going on right now. There is way too much information, and it isn't being filtered right. And if we're talking the states here, you're talking about one state versus another, different types of media taking it different levels of seriousness. Are we talking about a state where there's mass protests and they think that this thing is still a hoax? Are we talking like I disagree. And this is the problem you have with laws that are broad and sweeping, where there's going to be harm on one side or the other. Because whether or not you make a law like this, it's going to get it wrong in certain specific cases, because this tends to be a case-by-case style issue.
So if you have a restaurant and someone gets salmonella in your restaurant, aren't you liable?
Yeah, but COVID-19 and salmonella are slightly different, because you can test for salmonella and there are things you can do to prevent it.
Okay.
I mean,
So Lebanon is going to reopen their restaurants, allow them to reopen May 15th, but they can only open up 30% of their capacity. So arguably every third table is going to be available, but 2 out of every 3 tables is going to have to be closed. If you had such a rule in Ontario and a restaurant broke that rule and filled up all the tables, and then someone caught COVID-19 because of the lack of physical distancing, do you think they should be liable?
Yes, but that's us putting a rule in place beforehand. So if we've given them a specific process and said the conditions for you to open is following this process, and then they didn't follow that process, then yes. But we've given them a process in that case. Not you had to listen to what the media was saying before a lockdown act, mandatory lockdown called in place, and now you must have the premonition to believe you must close.
No, I'm not talking about people that had the premonition. I'm talking about people that knew. And there's examples. I'm not sure about Canada,
what?
frankly, but there's examples in the United States of movie theaters, of churches, of some places that went against social distancing rules and reopened. And frankly, these protesters that you're talking about are completely in contravention, because they're protesting against it, of the social distancing rules. And frankly, I think the organizers of these protests should be legally liable if people they encourage to come out and protest start getting sick.
No, I agree with that. But my issue is whether or not this is someone making the mistake that we're talking about before or after there was a mandatory stay-at-home order. So if it's before mandatory stay-at-home order and before mandatory business closure, I don't see the legal issue. I see the ethical issue, and I see the lack of information flow issue, and I see the public health issue. But legally, it doesn't make sense to me. There's no mandatory order yet. If it's post-mandatory order, yes, there's a mandatory order. But I don't see why you would blame a business or make them liable for staying open before the government told them to close.
Okay, I agree with that. Okay, so you're advising businesses on reopening. What are you going to do? How are you going to advise them?
Well, okay. I'm not advising most businesses to reopen right now, frankly. But if I was put in a position
where... Well, that's to start with, good advice. And in fact, that's what lots of people have been saying, is that even in some of these states like Georgia, that's opened up a bunch of places, restaurants, tattoo parlors, massage parlors, etc. A lot of the companies are saying they're choosing not to because their customers don't want to come back yet.
Yeah, and frankly, I think this is important, and I'll try not to rant too long on this. I've been very critical of the strategy that the federal government in particular has adopted for this since February, and I think it's important to separate strategy and tactics here. The general strategy of flatten the curve and slow down the spread, I don't tend to agree with, because looking at a disease like this, most people that you have to put on ventilators don't survive, right? And we talked about that before. So I don't tend to agree with the flatten the curve strategy. I tend to agree with a more completely crush the curve strategy. And we've talked about what that looks like in previous shows. However, if you're going to do the flatten the curve strategy, we've actually done it well for the strategy. So while I don't agree with the strategy, I agree with the way it's being done. Having said that, if you're doing it this way, you need to maintain this level of flattening essentially indefinitely until you have a cure, or it was almost pointless. So when you hear the premier say things like, we'll only reopen May 2-4 weekend if X, Y, Z, and then the media report, premier says we're going to open May 2-4, and then they say premier walks back to premier's words. And I'm saying Premier of Ontario here. My initial response is, I have never heard him say a statement without the contingent if X, Y, Z. Why are you mischaracterizing him? And so like the government's actually done the implementation of the strategy I don't agree with extremely well. And following in line with that, if you need to stay closed for a year to follow the strategy and your business wants to open up, you're not opening up. So on the thing of the protesters, I think that there's grounds to frankly arrest them and incarcerate them because of what they're doing, because you don't have freedom of protest in the middle of the Quarantine Act being used in the same way that you would outside, because you are a public health hazard. But the general strategy of Prime Minister is acting as the voice of calm and voice of we're all together, and Premier acting as the voice of parents saying, child, stop being a child, and that happening tends to work. And it's hard to be looking at the Premier like a reasonable parent when he's widespread arresting you. So I think, right? So speaking about the protesters things, I think they need to be handled. I think that's a problem. I don't think businesses should be opening. Yeah.
So let's talk about your crush the curve just for a second.
Sure.
I was interviewing someone from Lebanon, and it was interesting. You could only go out every second day. So based on whether your license ended in one odd number or an even number, it indicated whether you're allowed out on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, or Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. So only half the people in the city were allowed out every day. Mm-hmm. And then the whole place was closed down on Sundays. And then there was a curfew from 7 p.m. until 7 a.m. And then in addition, you weren't allowed out unless you were going to a grocery store or pharmacy. And then all the rules comparable to what we've got. And I think they've had 200 infections and something less than 20 fatalities for a city and country of over 6 million people, so comparable to the size of Toronto. So not Canada, not the United States, but still a fairly large metropolitan area. And that sounds like it's crushing the curve.
Well, that's a small enough number where you might be able to contact, trace, and test to the point where you can control it. In our case, I think we'd actually have to go further than that, because we have widespread transmission everywhere and we have no data on what's happening in the public. So the one thing that's really been bothering me about the data, which we've talked about in the past, is you keep hearing statements from the government to the media about how we're at a certain place with this thing spreading, how we're on a downward trajectory, we've peaked, et cetera, et cetera. There is no data to suggest that that is true or otherwise. We only have data on what's happening in Ontario, specifically in the long-term care homes and in hospitals primarily. We don't have data on the wide public. We don't have data on where it is. If you've ever had a runny nose and you've asked to be tested for it, you were likely told to stay at home and assume you have the virus. Further, if you were tested for it and tested negative, they still told you to stay at home because they thought it could have been a false negative. We don't know what's happening in the public at all. So
what they're doing is they're tracking mortalities, incubations, hospitalizations, IC usage, and they're using that to extrapolate up to how many people actually have the infection, are they not?
Yes, but if you have a 1 to 10% fatality rate disease, where there is a component of people that are spreading and going through this with mild to no symptoms, you have no idea where it is. And your strategy of flattening the curve is usually done to stop it from spreading and stop all contacts and community transmission. And if you have no idea who in your community has it, it doesn't work. You need to stop. You don't have to flatten it. You have to crush it. You have to stop transmission, period, or we all catch it anyways. And if 80-ish%, which some numbers are saying, but we can debate the number. It's over than 50, almost everyone agrees. If 80% of people who are seriously ill have to go onto a ventilator, die anyways, then by flattening the curve, you save 20% of the people 20% extra people of your fatalities by completely flattening this, if your hospital system never gets overly filled, and if at-home treatments are not viable, right? Like,
it's shocking that 80% of the people on incubation still pass away.
Right. And one other thing that I've heard a lot of critics say is, well, this affects young people too. Yes, but like any respiratory illness, or frankly, almost any illness, it disproportionately kills people who have weakened immune systems or people who have pre-existing respiratory conditions. If you are a smoker with COPD, if you are elderly, if you have an autoimmune disorder, if you have anything like that, statistically speaking, as with any virus, you're going to be disproportionately harmed. We've known that long-term care centers have been in ill repair and have had issues for decades. And to say that we haven't means that you probably don't have anyone in public health or who works in the healthcare system in your home telling you how bad it really is. But it's been an open secret for a long time. And we've known that this thing will disproportionately kill the elderly, just like every disease will. So it really irritates me how we're trying to get the atypical millennial, I just want to go shopping and let grandpa die demographic, which is what they're being characterized as in a lot of media right now. We're trying to get that demographic scared by saying they're going to die just like their grandparents are, which is the story. We're saying that, and then the millennial goes, oh no, but wait, that's not true. I'm just not going to listen to anything they say, and I'm just going to go out and break quarantine, which is what you're seeing them start talking about and start looking at. We've had people kill themselves due to the stress from staying at home. We've had memes come out on the internet where people are comparing this to the Holocaust, to Japanese internment, to other things that happened for years where we saw fatality rates that were massive, right? And saying, oh, just suck it up, stay at home, where the person who's sucking it up, stay at home is going, what's your problem? I want to go shopping.
Okay, so if you were in charge, how would you be talking to the millennial?
I wouldn't be treating them like they're unintelligent, because a millennial doesn't tend to respond well to that. I would be giving them the information and telling them straight, frankly. So saying, look, we don't know where this thing is in the public, and because of that, we have to keep this closed. We understand that a lot of people will not survive from this, but we're doing everything we can to save every life, because that's what the strategy is. The strategy is you're crushing your economy to save a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of people, but you're saying that it's worth it. And saying that honestly, saying, look, this is going to not be great, and it's worth it to save these lives. And they'll go, okay. And some of them will be what they are, but most people, if you speak to them honestly, in my experience, tend to respect the fact that you're speaking to them honestly, and you're telling them what you know.
Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada. Pretty good, frank advice to us. We're going to take a break for traffic and messages and come back more with Alex in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. We're chatting with Alex Vezina, the founder, CEO of Prepared Canada, an emergency preparedness company. And we're in emergency, and we weren't prepared enough for it. Alex, I want to ask you a couple of questions. There was this one conservative MP that was very critical of our public health leader. What do you think? Was that conservative MP right or wrong? And both in the content and in what they did.
Well, I mean, as I've said before, I'm very critical of strategies in general, but of the government strategy here, because I don't tend to agree with it. While I do agree with the way it's being implemented, I don't think it makes sense for Dr. Tam to act against Canada's interests personally. The accusation was essentially that Dr. Tam was working for the interests of China via some sort of evil or bad actions through the World Health Organization. It's a China plus World Health Organization pro-China, anti-Canada type of thing. I don't see, frankly, why she would do it. I see the advantages from a career standpoint of being the head of Canada's health strategy, basically, and doing it well to greatly outweigh any reason why you'd want to do something like that. And frankly, I don't see the value in the question. Almost every public health individual in Canada has agreed with this strategy. There has been some disagreement.
Strategy.
Sorry?
With Dr. Tam's strategy.
Yes, with Dr. Tam's strategy. There's on the emergency management side and like the military intelligence side and some other agencies, there has been some disagreement with the overarching strategy, but the general implementation, there hasn't been real disagreement. It's if you put virtually any other medical officer of health in that position, they would have done almost the same thing, if not the same thing. I can see a valid argument in being critical of the strategy. I don't see a valid argument in being critical of the person. So I might be wrong, but I don't think I am.
I thought it was incredibly inappropriate for a political leader to raise the concerns the way they did, and they were almost, I thought, racist.
Yeah, but maybe. Given, I mean, you can go off the stereotype of what the more right-wing, traditionally, or conservative political candidates may say on the further right wing, but I've also heard things like that being said that are far worse about other people in the government that were elected officials as opposed to appointed, that are significantly worse. And I don't know. I don't see great merit in us playing the "hey, you're less than human" game, especially during a time like this. Be it that person saying the things that they did about Dr. Tam, or frankly, anyone saying negative things about that person. It doesn't serve us very well to polarize ourselves and treat each other like enemies at the best of times. It doesn't serve us right now. So
now, one of the criticisms that both Canadian healthcare public health officials and U.S. public health officials have been criticized about is number one, not being in support of a travel ban as early as maybe they should, and that travel ended up being a major importation route for the virus into Canada. Number two, I think a lot of criticism in regard to that you can't transfer the virus asymptomatically. You can't be a transfer. And then obviously we learned more and that changed. And then also, I think finally, this concept of wearing a mask or a scarf that was initially said would not do any benefit. Now, public health are saying, do it. But aren't all those things because we learned more about the infection over time, and then we've learned that the infection was far more infectious than we ever thought, and far more infectious than a lot of other infections that have come along in the past?
No, it has to do with the level of seriousness that you're taking something, and the training done beforehand, and frankly, which people you're listening to. I mean, as we said before, we know the common cold exists. We've looked at doing exercises like this, and I mean, I can go into the longer discourse discussion rant that we had in the previous last week, but we could have trained for this. People in the government and in military and in emergency management and few in public health have known that something like this exists. We've known of viruses that spread before you are symptomatic, and you're just choosing to take a strategy that is more or less on the spectrum of short-term damage to economy, long-term vast reduction in cases, right? Like the second we knew that there was something like this in China, if you were taking this seriously, you shut your border. Basically, no one did, because basically no one took it seriously because there were so few people who were screaming at the top of their lungs, we have something that is this bad. By the way, you need to take this seriously. So is it their fault? Maybe, but it's more of a hindsight argument, I guess. But the people who knew the answer to this haven't been listened to for a very long time. So yeah, I don't see why it's productive, right? I don't see the issue here. I don't see why we're focusing on the blame game when we can be focusing more on what we're going to do in the next 3 months, what we're going to do in the next year. It's significantly more productive to talk about the way out of this and what life looks like than it is to say, oh, I dislike this political appointee or politician, in my opinion.
I agree with you. So let's talk about the way out of it. How do businesses plan? Let's say you're talking to a shop owner or a restaurant owner. What kind of advice are you going to be giving them? What kind of things are you going to be thinking about?
Okay, so in the restaurant industry in the States and Canada, but especially in the States, there has been a significant percentage of restaurants that haven't met basic health code for a very, very long time. The kind of things that happen in restaurants in North America have been, frankly, absolutely disgusting. If there is a silver lining out of coronavirus that we have, if anything, it's going to be that health and safety and certain sorts of health codes that we should have had enforced might actually be enforced now, and people might actually take those seriously as a byproduct of COVID-19. So one thing that I would advise them, frankly, is look at the basic stuff they haven't done yet, and then look at what they can do past that. With food preparation, it is extremely difficult to prevent all transmission if your chef is infected. And there are limitations in what you can do. But there are certain basic things that many businesses just frankly haven't done. The businesses that have a grill, that make that grill things and that have a lot of oily food, they don't clean out their grease traps, and many of them are just waiting to go up in flames. Businesses that don't clean their kitchen at all. Businesses that, frankly, on the health and safety side, don't defend their staff when their customers get a bit grabby, right? Things like that, if you look at coronavirus policies, also get affected as a nice secondary. You're not going to have as many people being grabby in a bar later at night when you have to social distance and when they're further away from the servers.
Okay. How can you socially distance in a bar?
Space. Whether or not it's practical, though, is going to be a good question. I don't think that you reasonably can, depending on how you construct the facility. You could, I suppose, create kind of like self-contained pods where you have entry and exit doors that don't have handles on them, like sway doors, at every booth or every table, where everyone could be kind of surrounded in plastic or glass or something. And you could distance that way. Depending on the virus, especially when we get a COVID-19 that ends up being airborne, which it's not yet, but just wait till next century. So once we get something that's like that, you have to look at not really spreading people apart from each other, but putting a physical barrier that catches the virus before it gets to them.
So I frequent a sushi restaurant.
Sure.
That has little booths, and you're in completely separate rooms. Is that going to be something that we're going to see?
Yeah, that's a better model. You still have to handle the multiple server or one server going to multiple tables problem, because they could pick up something infected and spread it to the next table, which is the same problem you've had, especially in SARS, with nursing staff and cleaning staff in hospitals, spreading it from one patient to another. It's a question of whether or not it's possible, frankly. But I think there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on the health side for businesses, and I think a model like that would help a lot of restaurants, especially. If not help them with stopping spread, at minimum help them with the perception of stopping spread, which in the end will get them more customers.
Okay, grocery stores. We've seen limiting how many people inside, going up and down specific aisles in specific directions, plexiglass installed between the cashier and the customer. Are those things, do you think, helpful?
Yeah, but once again, you also have the line outside is often not social distance the way it needs to be. If people aren't spread more than 6 feet apart in many cases. There's sometimes markings on the ground, but it's not enforced. And when you get to the cash register, people often don't stay on the other side of the glass the way they need to. They can't hear the cash register through the glass. They go around the side and start talking to them, kind of defeating the purpose of the glass. And everyone's sharing their hands on the Visa MasterCard debit machine. And they're often not wearing gloves, and if they are, one person didn't. People aren't using a pen or like something and pressing the numbers. There are still points of common infection. People take items, put them back. A lot of the same problems that you would have in a grocery store you're having, but there is some social distancing, so it's good, but it's probably not enough to stop something like this.
Let me ask you about produce. Like I'm perplexed about this. If
Yep.
if someone is picking up produce and or walking in front of produce, or even worse, coughing or sneezing on produce,
Yep.
and it's not packaged, isn't the chance of transmission huge?
Yep. Depending on the virus, and especially if they sneeze on it, right? But like it is depending on the virus and depending on how long it can live on the produce. But people are generally eating fresh produce right when they get home. They hopefully wash their produce, but there's a lot of stuff that can happen between the point they take it out of their car until they eventually go and wash it. People touch their face a lot.
So are we going to have more packaged produce, do you think?
Maybe, but then people touch the packaging, right? Everyone's going to the grocery store. So it's a matter of time before we have an infection at the grocery store. People don't appreciate just how easily this thing spreads. This is why when I'm putting another article out in the Sun. I think it's coming out next week, which details all this. But this is why in the conversation that we had last week, and as I keep telling people, if you want to stop this thing from spreading, you have to have people that are completely contained bringing you food and stopping this. Like we're talking about military in full protective gear, distributing groceries, distributing rations. The grocery stores are an infection zone. Like the thing is too infectious. You're spreading before you're symptomatic, and it spreads like the common cold. It's too infectious. It is near impossible to stop once you have community transmission. So people need to stop focusing and worrying on that and start looking at what life looks like when everyone has COVID. Like, you didn't stop it unless you brought in the military. So let's focus on the future.
Well, if everyone has COVID, then we're all immune.
Yeah, which is when we start asking the question, why didn't we just let it spread in the first place? The answer is because we didn't have enough ventilators for, 3-5% of the entire population to be infected at once. Why did that matter? Because we wanted to save 20% of that percentage, right? Is shutting down the economy for a year worth saving 1% of your population? I say yes. Some protesters say no, but that's the conversation that we're having. Right? Like,
puts it in pretty stark terms.
Yeah, but once again, can we focus on you're going to be able to go to a mall for one way or another, like either because it spreads everywhere, because it gets contained and everyone wants to go back out and then it spreads again, or whatever happens, you're going to be able to go back to a mall. The Canadian economy is going to have to nationalize, which is fine because there's going to be a local business that wants to hire you because the space is still there. Like, all our resources aren't going to magically disappear tomorrow. So we're still going to have stuff to do. We're still going to have goods and services to produce. So there's going to be a job. We're not a country that has more people than resources. We're one way or another, we will figure it out and be fine. Like, if this was a country where we didn't have a lot of resources, this would be a very different conversation, right? Like, as you know, but we're going to figure it out. How long that takes is an open question. But, I don't think people need to be that worried on that side. Right? Wrong? What do you think?
Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada. After some frank discussion, you left us in an optimistic manner. So thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to take a break for traffic and messages. And I'm going to come back and ask Alex about a second hit of the virus, which lots of people talking about being a potential concern. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on 2nd and 60. We're chatting again with Alex Vezina, the CEO of Prepared Canada, an emergency preparedness company. Alex, Spanish flu, 1918, 1919. A lot of the same issues were prevalent there, and we didn't even have global communication, media, et cetera. And so learning about what was happening in other countries, other cities, was a far slower, if at all, kind of situation. Lots of pressure to open up. Different cities, different countries, different states did open up in different manners. And the second wave was even more lethal than the first wave. And from what I understand, the second wave occurred in the fall of the subsequent season. So it would be as if it came this coming fall, 2020, by example in Canada. And then the third wave was even more lethal after that. So what do we do if we get hit with a second wave in the fall of this year?
So it's not a matter of if, but when. And this comes into I've been talking about this.
It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, seriously.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, this is what we've been talking about. This is my disagreement with the strategies that I've been saying this whole time. Because you have unchecked community transmission, once you open everything up, the people who you don't know where they are start spreading. And it's not like the slow one where it's a few people coming in through a border. Now it's a bunch of people who are already inside your border. Now, we already are having effectively a second wave. It's just the wave isn't very high right now. Like, it's still spreading, but once people start moving around, it starts spreading faster until you basically hit herd immunity. What happens with viruses like this is once you have community transmission, they spread until you reach herd immunity, or you get incredibly lucky and you actually crush them beforehand. That's what I've been saying and the underlying theme of this. So we're going to have a second wave. If the second wave doesn't make us reach herd immunity and we lock down again, then we're going to have a third wave. If that third wave, we don't reach herd immunity and we lock down again, we're going to have a fourth wave, et cetera, until we hit immunity.
And herd immunity is what? Over 50%?
The virus, if we're talking about vaccines for something like measles, mumps, rubella, you're talking about 95%. If you're talking about, or plus, if you're talking about something like this, we've said 50%, but in my opinion, this thing is much more transmissive. So it's, in my opinion, closer to 60, but I'm not a virus expert on that side. So the exact percentage number, I'm throwing a number out. But what I've been hearing is 50% plus, and I know that the herd immunity we look for vaccines, for measles and things that are way more infectious and way more deadly, is closer to 95+%. So we're looking at over half the population being infected. So that's going to happen. It's just a matter of when that happens, unless we get a vaccine first. Hence,
okay,
the government.
So you're in charge of public health. It's October 2020, and infection rates start to skyrocket, mortality starts to skyrocket, and hospitalizations, ECU usage, ventilators, etc. What do you do?
How long have
with
I
your
been,
squash scenario then?
how long have I been the head of public health? Because if so, then I squashed before then.
Okay, let's say I appoint you today.
Okay, well then I see if it's legal to do so, and if possible, I do what I've been outlining and I shut down everything. And then I actually try to squash this thing. And if I'm being advised from all my health experts, whether or not all my other experts and the people with data, that there's some data that I haven't seen before that says that this thing is impossible to squash, then I frankly tell the public that it's impossible to squash and we're all going to get it. And that, not all literally, but all, approximately all, and that we're going to be going through a significant amount of hardship to save 20% of the people that are savable, or of people that are going to be, that are going to otherwise die if we don't treat them. And tell them, frankly, that's what we're doing. That's why we're doing it. We're saving these people and being honest, and people will accept it or not. But further, there's one other thing about the second wave that I think people aren't talking about. While this thing doesn't mutate like the flu, it does mutate. And from what I've been seeing, there have been a few cases in China and a few cases around the world from a separate strain of this that have come out that has been infecting people that already had the first strain. And traditionally what happens with flu vaccines is the flu vaccine is made 12 months approximately before the flu comes out. And based on a previous version, they make vaccines and guess what the new one's going to look like because of how long the thing takes to the vaccine takes to mutate. If COVID actually starts mutating rapidly, then what we're going to have is the new version of the common cold, except this common cold kills 3 to 5% of your population. And if we have that, then the second wave is not here for a bit. The second wave is here until we cure the common cold, which means if you have weak lungs, you die indefinitely. Like I'm talking, like we're talking about the evolution of the species and Darwin hammering us. Like that is really what I'm concerned about, which necessitates crushing it. Because if this thing mutates and a vaccine becomes completely pointless and we can't stop it, then we really, really need to basically cure the common cold right now, which frankly would require probably a worldwide lockdown. Good luck with that. In the positive note, because you got me negative again, Brian. Okay, so on the positive note, one, I really hope I'm wrong there. And two, on the economic side, you're going to be fine. And that percentage is still, 3 to 5%. It's not 50%. It's not measles. It's not one of the things that we've had in the past that has huge, huge fatality rates. So, this is possibly what the new normal looks like. But frankly, we're going to have jobs and we're going to otherwise be fine. And if we're not, then we'll end up being there anyways through a bunch of stuff that's going to get way too negative.
Alex Vezina, CEO, Prepared Canada. It's not always a pleasure to talk to you because you are a little bit negative, but I think realistically so. And so it is illuminating to chat with you. And I appreciate your time with us, telling us about the concerns. So thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me again, Brian. I'm trying to be positive.
We're going to take one final break for traffic and messages, and I'm going to come back with a few concluding comments. Stay with us. Well, that was a frank conversation with Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada, on what's happened, how he disagrees with the strategy, but agrees with the tactics that we've been executing in Canada. Some of the concerns about what companies have got, what businesses have got to be mindful of as they reopen, and some concerns about a second wave. And I got to tell you that the second wave potentiality for the fall of this year is something that really concerns me. I've been doing a little bit of research and reading on the Spanish flu pandemic, 1918, 1919, 1920. And it was a very similar situation. I really worry that we have not listened to and learned from history. What happened then is there was a huge amount of political backlash against the people that were doing the social isolation. There was, comparable to what we're seeing in the United States, protests and political pressure on different states, different cities to open up. And the cities that opened up early, the states that opened up early, ended up having dramatically more infections and dramatically more mortality than the other ones. And the economic hit was even worse. And so, I worry that the pressure on the politicians today, because of the protests, because of, partisan politics, because of everything that's going on, the pressure is just almost unstoppable to the politicians that they're going to have to reopen. But I think Governor Cuomo in New York said it best. He says, I'm going to come out with some rules and regulations, but in the end, it is your responsibility as a business to make sure that you can reopen in a healthy and hygienic manner. And I think that, frankly, businesses need to take that responsibility on, because even if the politicians allow us to open, we've got to be mindful that these are our customers. These are our people. And we've got to make sure that if we reopen only in a very healthy, hygienic manner. And we've got to be thinking through the physical distancing, the social distancing, the barriers, everything like that. Because if people get sick or if employees get sick, we should take responsibility for that. And you think about what happened in that Spanish flu epidemic. More people died in the second wave. Let's not have that happen. Let's do the things that Alex is suggesting we need to do now and over the summer in anticipation of let's plan that there will be a second wave in the fall and plan to deal with it in the best way possible. Anyway, thanks again to Alex Vezina, CEO of Prepared Canada. And thank you for joining us on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM, or you can get me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts on my website, briancrombie.com, either backslash podcast or backslash video. Thanks for joining us. Good night.